thank Bernadette for such an engaging topic and continuation of all the conversations during this session. And I would like to welcome our third speaker, and with a topic, very interesting topic, open versus proprietary in robotics, a $1 trillion tension, and a little bit background about Professor Milford. So he conducts interdisciplinary research at the intersection between robotics, neuroscience, and computer vision, and is a multi-award winning educational social innovator. His research models the neural mechanisms in the brain underlying tasks like navigation and perception to develop new technologies in challenging application domains, such as all-weather, anytime positioning for autonomous vehicles. And he has a lot of research about other aspects of robotics and won a lot of awards for his papers as well, which are available through our QUT e-prints. So I welcome Professor Milford for the next.
Cheers. All right. Thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I must admit I do a lot of talks every year, probably about 50 or 60 around the world, but not usually on this topic. So it's actually fun to delve into something a little bit different. A disclaimer, which is probably not legally binding, what I would like to do is spend the brief time I have with you familiarizing yourself with the interesting, from my perspective at least, somewhat surreal landscape across these technology areas that you hear about in the news. So robotics, autonomous vehicles, and artificial intelligence, or AI, just to name a few. The primary purpose of doing that briefly is to give you some context for about 10 key issues that I'll just walk you through from my perspective that are key to, I guess, the topic area of today's forum. So I'm a nerd by life, by background. I love robots. I love robotic science fiction, but I come from a large robotics group at QUT. We have a centre called the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision, as well as a number of other research activities. And our speciality is taking all that far out artificial intelligence technology that you see in the news and trying to make it actually work in deployments and applications with a whole heap of different industry domains in the air, on the ground, underneath the water, and so forth. It doesn't always work, but when it does, it's good. If you want more information, look us up. We do a lot of commentary, outreach, roadmaps of the technology scene in Australia as part of our centre. But what I'll do is I'll start off by just briefly previewing these key technology areas, once again to provide some context for these issues I'll talk about. So, who here has a robot vacuum cleaner in their house? Does it save you time? No, okay. 50-50, that's not a bad strike rate for a new technology. Robot vacuum cleaners have been around for 10, 15 years. I think about 20 million have been sold, and that's growing. A revolution in the history of technology, because it was the first time people were buying a robot not as a novelty item, but because they're lazy, and for some people it saved them 5 or 10 minutes a week. And that's a really critical turning point in any technology where you're not buying it for the novelty, you're buying it just because it will help you. Doesn't always help you, but in some cases. Maybe your house must just not be appropriate. Yeah, too many up and downs. You've got to buy a new house for your robot. Ooh.
They need a robot.
So you would have seen there are far more capable robots. The physical, mechanical capability of these robots is continually advancing. I got to play with this robot in Montreal a few months ago, and it's incredible. To physically see it in person running towards you is a momentous event. But these are very capable. It's a half-hour runtime, and you'll be able to buy these very shortly. So robots have been continuously advancing. So it's not just the boring robots you see in factories. You can see this robot as well, which is my height and my weight, and can do things like backflip, which I definitely can't do. So physically, these robots are quite capable. Obviously, that's part of the story. The data, the artificial intelligence is also critical to making these useful. They're everywhere. Logistics, if you buy anything online, you're using robots to get your product to you. And stores like this is particularly interesting from a privacy and data. I went to the Amazon Go store in San Francisco recently, and there's cameras everywhere, hundreds of cameras filming you. You just pick up a thing and walk out the door and it charges you. So you can imagine all sorts of issues. Closer to home, Automation is being used everywhere, quietly in many aspects. The Port of Brisbane's been semi-automated for quite a while. Mining, which is an area we work in, is highly automated. And people like Woolworths and Coles are also looking heavily and investing heavily in these sort of technologies. The self-driving cars, once again, a long history, 20, 30, 40 years of autonomous vehicles. We still don't have them yet. But companies like Waymo, which I got to visit last year, and I got to drive in their first car in 2012 as well, are very close. The cars are incredibly capable, but not yet deployable. And there are people doing things like delivery, pizza delivery. This is one of our students who's working for $1 billion startup in California. And these add, again, interesting data issues because it's a supermarket or a pizza company working with an autonomous vehicle company. You can think about the benefits and also pitfalls of sharing data across those boundaries. The big one, of course, is artificial intelligence. I say that's the big one because it relies entirely on software and computational power. It doesn't require hardware like autonomous cars or robots do. And hardware is quite hard. It's advancing, but relatively slowly, whereas artificial intelligence, there's no real limits to how quickly it could develop. Doesn't mean it will, but it could. The other thing to remember, and this is, I guess, you probably heard this theme of trying to catch up in terms of regulating and all these sort of issues, is modern artificial intelligence is extremely modern. It's extremely recent. The sort of recent wave or resurgence in AI is only about 6 to 7 years old, which has come with the sort of resurgence of some key technologies. If you pay attention to Ruslan on the right, this is us in 2013 in Seattle, where Microsoft was nice enough to give us all fellowship awards. At that time, most of this modern AI craze had not really got going yet. This is only 6 years ago. So it's been an incredible last 6 years, and it hasn't shown any signs of slowing down. Everyone but me. And one thing which also influences the historical perspective on all of these fields in terms of how quickly should we go is the history. So in the past, technologies have been hyped up. There have been things called AI winters where there's no money, there's no funding. To really stretch the analogy, we're in the middle of the hottest AI summer on record, and there's effectively unlimited resources. There's more resources than talent currently globally in this field. What's changed? And this comes back to things like data. So the data that you have available, I'm sure someone's talked about facial recognition already. We're all happily helping, or many of us are happily helping these companies train their algorithms to be smarter. When you do these security captures, you're also training these AIs to be smarter. It's not an accident that most of them are autonomous vehicle themed, because that's what they're interested in. The compute available has also gone up. So for $1,000, you can get an incredibly powerful computational unit in your PC. Which actually has a minor beneficial sort of democratization effect, because if you're smart and you've got a couple of $1,000, theoretically you could set up something amazing in your cliched garage and really disrupt an industry. So that's good. What can I do? So I'll just show you two things and then I'll get on to the key issues. Have you seen this?
I'm calling to book a women's haircut for a client. I'm looking for something
Have you seen
on
it
May
today?
3rd. Sure, give me 1 second. Sure, what time are you looking for around? At 12 p.m. We do not have a 12 p.m. available. The closest we have to that is a 1:15. Do you have anything between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m.? Depending on what service she would like. What service is she looking for? Just a woman's haircut for now. Okay, we have a 10 o'clock. 10 a.m. is fine. Okay, what's her first name? The first name is Lisa. Okay, perfect. So I will see Lisa at 10 o'clock on May 3rd. Okay, great. Thanks. Great. Have a great day. Bye.
So obviously they cherry-picked some of the best examples, but the fact that the system is actually capable of doing that is quite incredible. And in this case, they did get in a bit of trouble because allegedly they weren't necessarily informing the person on the other end of the phone that they were speaking to a robot. But you can see the premise is there. These things are quite capable. This is another example. I'm only picking 2 examples of literally hundreds or thousands. Does anyone know what's special about these people?
They don't exist.
Yeah, they don't exist. So they've been generated artificially. 2014, you could do that grey, grainy image at the top in 5 or 6 years. Once again, commensurate with that timetable I talked about, you can do this. Huge implications for all sorts of things, like all technology. Stock photography and stock video could disappear in terms of modeling because you can just artificially generate it, and these artificial things have no rights. But it's interesting because these systems have been trained originally using real facial data. So it's a very interesting field. All right, so that's just a brief, well, that's normally like a 40-minute talk, so hopefully it wasn't too rushed, but just a few key issues. And I guess to give you some perspective, because I know there's a very interesting wide range of perspectives here. I'm speaking from the perspective of a young academic trying very hard to maintain a traditional academic career of doing fundamental research, staying relevant by collaborating with all of these companies operating in this field, and having a significant footprint in terms of public policy development, outreach and engagement, and education. Not doing it very well, but that's the sort of perspective I'm bringing to this debate. So the first thing, and this is something that comes up as a misconception everywhere I go, people traditionally think about companies developing up patent portfolios and technology assets and stuff like that. In these core areas, although that's still true to a large extent, much of the resources, investments, and capability is based around individual people. The example I always use to carry this home is this is a person who was about my age when this happened, and his bonus in the court proceedings is $157 million. Now that's an outlier, but as I said, there's effectively unlimited money in this field. And it's based on people. Most of the people that these companies are buying for $10, $40, $50 million are not bringing any IP with them. They're just bringing themselves, and the fact that they know how to tweak all the knobs of the technology in a way that 99.999% of the rest of the population. So that's important context. Okay, so what are the good things in robotics, in autonomous vehicles, in artificial intelligence? So one of the good things is there is a lot of good, openly accessible data. This is an example from autonomous vehicles. It's a famous data set where they put lots of sensors on a car and release the data set, and it's become the pseudo benchmark for everyone to benchmark and test their systems on, including in the early days, even autonomous vehicle companies. Now the bigger autonomous vehicle companies, especially the ones which are backed by nearly $1 trillion companies, they'll do a lot of this in-house. But these open access data sets are still incredibly important for both the academic community and also the industry and startup community. So that's good. We always complain about the fact that we train up all these talent and then they all disappear pretty much overseas. So that is bad in the short term. One of the good things, if you go to industry or startups throughout the world in these areas, there is a very heavy academic influence in these companies still, because so much of their talent comes from an academic background. And although academics aren't great at everything, it does bring a strong interest in open sourcing, public good, and making stuff available. So that influence shouldn't be discounted, and it is a very positive thing. One of the key things that drives technology development in all of these fields is access to what we call simulation environments. So imagine instead of testing an autonomous vehicle on the road, where it might hit someone, you test these autonomous vehicles on very powerful computers in very powerful simulation environments. And one of the other good news stories is, once again, researchers or industry practitioners or even governments trying to assess the impact of these technologies, you have access to a wide range of best-of-breed, high-quality simulation environments, mostly free. Now, there are some caveats with that. Sometimes to actually run the simulation environment, you might need specialist hardware from a vendor, like the computers, to run it, which will require you to spend some money. But overall, it's a positive trend. The big companies, of course, have their own proprietary simulation environments that they protect zealously because it's like a key tool in their arsenal. But at least these other things exist outside of individual companies. There is a very big push towards open sourcing of data and code across the whole field. Practically speaking, it gets increasingly difficult to get your research accepted to conferences or grants if you don't open source the data and the code. And also grant schemes and funding agencies obviously are increasingly making it a prerequisite of doing the work in the first place. There's a whole heap of asterisks on that though, which I'll go over in the next slide. So this is just some of the code we've open sourced just from my little research group over the last few years. The bad is that the stuff that industry or universities release, one of the bads is that one of the major things you're trying to do is do commercial work, right? You're trying to commercialize work, develop new technology for companies. Startups are trying to do this as well. And these partners are generally quite reluctant for you to touch anything that comes from the open source community, especially under certain licensing restrictions, because if you do something really great, they'll be forced to then share stuff they don't want to share when they sell that product onwards. And that makes it really difficult. If we weren't allowed to use any open source software in a project, it literally adds about an order of magnitude difficulty, timeline, and cost to the project, which basically makes it untenable. So that's a fundamental point of tension in this industry. There's a huge replicability crisis in all of these fields. You'd hear about this in health as well. In machine learning and robotics, this is the same. I think people have assessed that maybe 60% of papers are not replicable, even though all the source code and the data is provided. And that's because the researchers have either intentionally or unintentionally neglected to mention all the knob tuning they had to do of all the specific parameters in their system. And whether it's intentional or not intentional, it creates a fundamental problem in this field. So replicability is another major challenge. One of the things that in the research community is researchers suck at a lot of things by nature. So we're never trained formally, or very few of us are trained formally to manage large groups. Most of us are not formally trained to deal with complex licensing choices with software. So a lot of it we pick up on the go, and we don't necessarily do a very good job of it. An example from with some projects with industry we're trying to start is I sat down with some lawyers here who were trying to run me through a gazillion different software licensing options as it pertains to the contract negotiations with this big company. And even as a reasonably literate person, it was just overwhelmingly complex. And I'm not great at it, but I'm also not poor at it. So this is a pervasive issue throughout the field. And the consequences of this, of course, is we miss things. Bad consequences happen either in that we are too accommodating and sharing everything without getting benefit, or the opposite happens where the company ends up with something they can't actually earn money from, which is just as damaging because that company then never wants to work with us again, and that's really bad as well. You'll hear in academia, once again, I'm focusing a little bit on academia and research, even though there's not many of us left here. But you'll hear this, of course, emphasis on impact, which is great. There's a lot of counterintuitive things, at least in our community, about achieving impact. So one of the obvious ones is open sourcing your data and open sourcing the code, the programming that you've used to create your system. The rule of thumb or intuition used to be if you want to get lots of impact and you want everyone to use your stuff, you should open source it. I've become increasingly cautious about recommending that because in a lot of cases, obviously if you open source it, you immediately cut out a large fraction of potential industry interest. And perversely, sometimes open source code isn't used as widely as paid for code or code that you have to pay to license, especially if it's affiliated with a big brand name sort of company. So these rules of thumb are once again, they have these asterisks, or what's the plural of asterisks? Asterisks after them, which is especially important when we're advising young academics who are at a critical stage of their career. The other thing is not everything is shared. So this was OpenAI's essay writing AI, to use the term loosely. So you could give it a prompt, recycling is good for the world, and you said you need to argue for this or against this, and so I was able to write this essay at the bottom, which would definitely meet the quality criteria for essays that are being sold on those cheating websites at some grade level. And the thing to remember is that that was a snapshot in time. It will be better in 3 months' time, probably better again in 3 months' time. So they decided not to release this. OpenAI has a very strong, I think, public mandate. It was co-founded by Elon Musk, but they decided not to release basically the mechanics that enable this to happen. Now, if you're a cynic, you'd say it's a PR stunt and it generated more PR. It definitely helped generate publicity for this. But there could also generally be a genuine concern about this, especially in the era of fake news and spamming and having difficulty trusting the quality of sources. Now you could say, and this will turn into an arms race very quickly because you'll have a bunch of very well-funded people developing these to spread whatever agenda they have. You'll have a bunch of people, and I have colleagues who are doing this, trying to determine automatically whether a news source is authentic or not, and you just get into that typical arms race that goes back and forth. The sharing of data and code is very often good in theory and horrible in practice for many reasons. The most common reason is these companies or organizations share incredible amounts of raw data, and unless you are a equivalently cashed up company, definitely not a university, you don't have the means to actually do anything useful with it. So even though in paper you can access the data, you can't do anything with it. You definitely can't do anything interesting with it. So it's theoretically accessible, but not in practice. Same for code as well. Maybe you've got the code, you can compile it, but you don't have the hardware or equipment to run it or to evaluate it thoroughly. There's other things like delays in sharing. So in my field, it's very, very competitive, right? So if you get a technology advance 6 or 12 months in advance of someone else, that could turn into a $1 billion startup, literally overnight. So it's very competitive around timing. This could be algorithms, software, data sets, or even physical hardware like sensors or robotic hardware. So often these are either accidentally or accidentally on purpose. The release of them, even though it was promised to be released, is delayed. So you have a paper come out, the organization will have published using that, and they'll say, we're going to share the data, but you don't actually get useful access to that data because there's some iteration for maybe 18 months. And 18 months is an incredibly long time in my field. So once again, on paper, people are sharing it, and whether it's intentional or not, in practice, no one's really getting any benefit out of it. So it's sort of very gray in this area. Data across all of these fields, and you've heard this, I'm sure, repeatedly today, it's incredibly valuable, but obviously, especially in the proprietary company case, it's not yet open. If you're a ride-sharing company with a large amount of data, you can answer the most incredibly specific questions about your consumer sentiment. So you could potentially answer, how many dollars could I raise a fare by at 8 o'clock in this particular location with this particular demographic of customer before they won't pay the fare? And that data is incredibly valuable. And as you see the race for autonomous vehicles sort of plateau a little bit, we don't have them, we don't know when we'll have them, the data that these companies have gathered may become their most useful pivot and most useful resource. The other thing about data is, and this is one of the problems that worries me the most, there are and I'm not saying I'm one of these people either, there are very, very few people with a deep enough, genuine technical understanding of AI, robotics, and automation who are also playing a high-level role in policy influence. The standard model is you have a level of abstraction where you have someone who is doing the policy influence who's consulting with that technical expert, which is good, but it's not the same, and I've seen a lot of sort of potentially very bad situations develop because you don't have a one-stop shop who can answer that. It's especially dangerous because if you have, I talk about levels of understanding of the technology, most like consultants, for example, are very bright, very eloquent people who are very good at researching a topic, and they might get down to 1 or 2 levels of understanding of the technology, but in order to make critical decisions, you really need that 3rd or 4th level of understanding. And if they're getting it secondhand from technical experts who may not be very good communicators themselves, all sorts of really horrendous stuff can happen. I always say that the technical meetings I go to and the policy-related meetings I go to all around Australia and the world, there's a Venn diagram and there's no overlap in the middle of the people who are at both of those meetings, which is extremely concerning. Another example of this is just data. So we're talking about data access and being able to request your data. In the case of autonomous vehicles, for example, or even non-autonomous vehicles, I had a conversation with one of your colleagues the other day, and I was informing them that if you gave the speedometer data from the car, so no steering data, no GPS data, just the speedo data, you could probably reverse engineer where that person lives. And that completely buoyed them, and they actually went and modified their presentation that they were just about to give. And that was the one I pointed out, but there's all these other ones we're not picking up. So that lack of deep understanding of what you could do with the data, which is in some respects almost impossible to get complete, is also a potential risk factor. I guess on the positive side, data accessibility, which pervades all of these fields, accessibility across boundaries. I think someone already talked about smart cities today, but if you look at how to really optimize operations in a complex system like a city, you want data accessibility across all the current artificial boundaries to optimize, for example, in transport, public transport, private transport, ride-sharing transport, mass transit transport. That currently does not exist, although there are many cities looking into doing this with some of the current players. If you do it right, it could be amazing for the city. If you do it wrong or you have nefarious interest involved there, you can imagine all sorts of not productive outcomes from it as well. So you really need to balance all of these. And I guess that's me. Thanks.